Good morning, my name is Jacqueline Sabal and I will be presenting the gross domestic product for the fourth quarter of 2020. The order of my presentation is as follows. I will highlight the production in the fourth quarter of 2020 and further go in detail about the industries within the primary, the secondary, and finally the tertiary sector. First, we'll start with a definition of what exactly the gross domestic product is. GDP is defined as the total value of all finished goods and services produced within an economy in a given period. GDP is used as the main indicator of economic activity within a country. GDP estimates are produced based on information received from financial statements, production information from the government, private businesses, as well as non-government organizations. To determine the country's GDP, we assess the three productive sectors of the economy. The primary sector, which includes raw materials that can be processed into a finished good. These are products of agriculture, fisheries, forestry, mining, etc. The secondary sector, this includes industries that take the raw materials produced by the primary and processes them into manufactured goods. And lastly, the tertiary sector, which includes the production of services instead of an end product. For example, hotels providing accommodation services. For the fourth quarter months of October to December 2020, Belize produced goods and services totaling $592.6 million. This represents a decrease of $89.6 million or 13.1% when compared to the fourth quarter of 2019. Preliminary annual estimates for the year 2020 indicate that goods and services produced totaled $2,475.1 million. This represents a decrease of 14% from $2,880.9 million produced in 2019. If we take a closer look at the annual GDP from 2015 to 2020, we observe a sharp decline in overall output in the year 2020, reflecting the severe economic effects of COVID-19. Now, if we assess what each sector contributes to the overall GDP, the sector whose movements make the most impact is the tertiary sector. Declines in contributions of the tertiary sector to the overall GDP are clearly observed over the past year. Now, looking at what each sector contributed in the fourth quarter of 2020 alone, the sector with the largest contribution was again the tertiary sector, which accounted for 61.4% of production. The secondary sector accounted for 15.9%, the primary sector 9.2%, and the remaining 13.6% was in taxes. Looking specifically at the fourth quarter GDP at constant prices over a 7-year period, the graph highlights fluctuations in the GDP from 2015 to 2019, followed by a significant 13.1% decline in production in the year 2020. During this period, production within the tertiary sector declined, overshadowing increased production in both the primary and the secondary sectors. Looking first at the primary sector, output increased to $54.3 million during the fourth quarter of 2020. This represents growth of 0.6% or $0.3 million when compared to the fourth quarter of 2019. Within the primary sector, agriculture, hunting, and forestry grew by 13.7% or $5.7 million, totaling $47 million. However, the fishing industry contracted by a significant 42.3% during the quarter as marine exports dropped by $5.3 million, bringing this industry total to $7.3 million. Now we'll break down the industries within the primary sector, looking first at what contributed to the growth within agriculture and which commodities aided in the decline in fishing. In the case of banana production, improved weather conditions from the severe drought experienced in 2019, coupled with an increase in acreage, contributed to a 20.6% increase in banana output, from 22.9 thousand metric tons produced in the fourth quarter of 2019 to 27.7 thousand metric tons produced in the fourth quarter of 2020. Despite a late start to the crop season, 16.7 thousand metric tons of sugarcane was delivered during the fourth quarter of 2020, which reflects an increase in deliveries compared to 2019, when no sugarcane was harvested during the same period. Compared to 2019, when prolonged dry weather contributed to a substantial decrease in citrus fruit deliveries, in 2020, improved weather conditions resulted in a late crop. Deliveries increased by 28% from 2.5 thousand metric tons produced in quarter 4 of 2019 to 3.1 thousand metric tons produced in quarter 4 of 2020. Now looking at the livestock industry. Overall production increased marginally by 1%. Poultry and pig production both declined by 3.3% and 14.2% respectively, while a positive 20.8% rise in cattle production was able to overshadow the decreases within this industry. Increased market demand from neighboring countries grew cattle exports by 24.2%, coupled with an increase in local demand by 6.4%. Overall, cattle production grew by 20.8%, from 8,600 heads produced in quarter 4 of 2019 to 10,400 heads in 2020. Poultry producers experienced a 3.3% decrease in production as the COVID-19 restrictions placed on restaurants and the lack of tourist visitors to the country continued to take effect. In total, 11 million pounds of birds were slaughtered in the fourth quarter of 2020, compared to 11.4 million pounds slaughtered during the same period in 2019. A decrease in pig exports was the main contributor to a 14.2% drop in production. Approximately 1,600 less heads were produced during quarter 4 of 2020 when compared to 2019. Now moving to the fishing industry. This industry declined by 42.3% during the fourth quarter as all marine commodities recorded decreased exports. Exported shrimp declined by 57.6%, conch by 27.5%, lobster meat by 61.1%, and lobster tail by 25.4%. Now looking at the secondary sector. Production within the secondary industries increased by 22.5%. This represents a $17.3 million rise in output, bringing the total for this industry to $94 million for the quarter. The driving factor in this increase is the electricity and water industry, which grew by a substantial 102%, or $19.5 million, bringing that industry total to $39 million. Construction activities increased by 7.1%, or $1.6 million, evidenced by an increase in loans for building and construction, coupled with a rise in cement imports. Applying some negative pressure to the secondary sector was the manufacturing and mining industry, which decreased by 11.2%, or $3.9 million, bringing this industry total to $31 million. Now we'll look closely at each of these industries. During the months of October to December 2020, the electricity and water industry grew by 101.6%. Electricity generation recorded a significant 142.3% increase in production, while water consumed during the quarter decreased by 7.4%. Compared to the prolonged dry weather conditions experienced in 2019, heavy rainfall, the effects of Hurricane Iota and Hurricane Eta, drove an increase in the hydropower supply. Production grew from 45.6 thousand megawatt hours produced in 2019 to 110.4 thousand megawatt hours produced in 2020. Heavy rainfall had the opposite effect on water consumption, which decreased by 7.4% during the quarter, from 672.4 millions of gallons consumed in 2019 to 622.5 millions of gallons in 2020. Within the manufacturing and mining industry, beverage production continued to suffer from the lack of tourist visitors to the country and the restrictions placed on restaurants and bars due to COVID-19. Production declined by 8.9% during the quarter compared to 2019. Beer production dropped 15.3% and soft drink production saw a marginal increase of 1%. A total of 624.4 thousands of gallons of beer was produced in 2020, down 112.8 thousands of gallons, or 15.3% from 2019. However, soft drink production recorded a slight 1% increase in output from 1,860.9 thousands of gallons produced in 2019 to 1,879.4 thousands of gallons, attributed to a decrease in imported soft drink. Petroleum extraction for the fourth quarter months decreased by 24.6%, as approximately 16,000 less barrels were extracted from reservoirs in 2020 compared to 2019. Despite an overall decrease in the manufacturing and mining industry, increased sugarcane deliveries aided in a rise in sugar production. 0.7 thousand metric tons of sugar was produced during the quarter 4 of 2020, compared to 2019 when no sugar was produced during this quarter. Also attributed to a rise in deliveries, citrus concentrate production increased by 18.4%, from 43.4 thousands of gallons produced in quarter 4 of 2019 to 51.4 thousands of gallons produced in 2020. The services sector remains the most severely impacted by COVID-19, recording a significant 18.8% drop or $84.4 million decrease across all tertiary industries, bringing this industry total down to $363.7 million. Within this sector, the wholesale and retail trade subsector contracted by 22.1%, as less crude materials, mineral fuels and lubricants, machine and transport equipment, and manufactured goods were imported into the country. The hotels and restaurants industry declined considerably by 88.8%, bringing the total for that industry to $3.2 million. Nationwide restrictions due to COVID-19 interrupted local land, sea, and air transportation, resulting in a 20.4% decline in the transport and communication subsector, totaling $45 million for that industry. Producers of government services also decreased by 3.3% or $3 million, observed through a decline in government salaries. Now we'll look closer at the hotels and restaurants industry. Despite the opening of the international airport in October, activities within the hotels and restaurants subsector remained virtually non-existent compared to previous years. Cruise ship calls have not commenced since March of 2020, while overnight tourist arrivals have declined by 85.6%, from approximately 120,000 visitors in quarter 4 of 2019 to 17,000 in 2020. And just to recap, for the fourth quarter of 2020, GDP decreased by 13.1% compared to the same period of 2019. Production across the primary sector increased by 0.6%, the secondary sector grew by 22.5%, and while the tertiary sector decreased by 18.8%.